"I'll pay you what your silence is worth," the millionaire mocked the maid, but when he saw what she hid in her pocket, his face completely changed. The truth was far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. "I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you." The November wind cut through the streets of Chicago like a knife, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors and the distant hum of traffic on Michigan Avenue. In the towering glass monument that was the Hawthorne Building, 43 floors above the bustling city, silence reigned absolute. The penthouse apartment stretched endlessly, its marble floors reflecting the cold light of crystal chandeliers that had never known the warmth of genuine laughter. Maria Santos moved through these rooms like a ghost, her worn sneakers making barely a whisper against the polished stone. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing and cleaning, gripped the mop handle with practiced efficiency. At 54, her face carried the map of a life lived in service to others. Fine lines around her dark eyes spoke of countless early mornings, and the slight stoop in her shoulders told the story of decades spent bending to clean up after those who never bothered to learn her name. But there was something else in Maria's bearing, something that no amount of exhaustion could diminish. In the way she held her chin just a fraction higher than necessary, in the careful precision with which she arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases, in the soft humming that sometimes escaped her lips as she worked, there lived a dignity that wealth could never purchase. Her uniform, pressed and pristine despite being bought second-hand, was worn like armor against a world that insisted she remain invisible. The apartment itself was a monument to success built on foundations of sorrow. Oil paintings worth more than most people's annual salaries hung on walls that never heard conversation. A grand piano, its ebony surface gleaming but silent, stood like a tomb in the corner of the living room. Every surface sparkled, every thread of the Persian rugs lay in perfect alignment, yet the space felt dead, hollowed out by grief that money couldn't heal. Samuel Hawthorne entered his domain each evening like a king returning to a conquered territory, one that brought him no joy. At 48, he moved through his empire of glass and steel with the calculated precision of a man who had learned that emotions were liabilities in the world of high finance. His suits, tailored on Savile Row, cost more than Maria made in 3 months. His watch, a Patek Philippe inherited from his grandfather, ticked away seconds that felt like hours in the mausoleum of his home. The shadows under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent reviewing investment portfolios and cryptocurrency markets, anything to avoid confronting the empty spaces where laughter once lived. His wife Catherine's death had arrived like a financial crash, sudden, devastating, and leaving him to navigate a world where all his assets and capital meant nothing against the crushing weight of loss. Maria had witnessed the slow transformation of this house from sanctuary to tomb. She remembered when children's voices echoed through these halls, when Catherine's gentle laughter filled the spaces between furniture, when Samuel's smile wasn't just a business transaction but something genuine and warm. Now 13-year-old Lily moved through the apartment like a shadow of her former self, and 16-year-old Marcus barely came home, preferring the impersonal comfort of boarding school to the cold perfection of his father's domain. The morning Maria had first arrived, stepping off the red line at Chicago Avenue with her modest purse clutched tight and her heart hammering with the need for this job, she had no idea she was walking into a battlefield disguised as luxury. The elevator ride to the 43rd floor felt like ascending into another world, one where the air itself seemed thinner, more precious, and definitely not meant for the likes of her. Samuel's previous housekeeper had quit without notice, leaving behind whispered warnings about the impossible standards and the glacial atmosphere that froze even the hardiest of souls. The employment agency had warned Maria that Mr. Hawthorne was particular and demanding, corporate euphemisms that translated to one simple truth. He was a man drowning in his own grief who had forgotten how to treat other human beings with basic kindness. Their first meeting had been a masterclass in cold assessment. Samuel's steel-gray eyes had swept over her like a scanner pricing inventory, calculating her worth not as a person, but as a resource. His handshake had been perfunctory, lasting exactly 2 seconds, long enough to demonstrate power, short enough to establish distance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of boardroom authority mixed with the bitter edge of a man who had lost faith in human connection. The other staff members, the doorman who looked through her as if she were transparent, the building manager who spoke to her in single syllables, the delivery personnel who treated her like an inconvenience, had taught Maria that in this world she existed only as function, never as person. But she had survived worse. Growing up in Pilsen, in a 2-bedroom apartment shared with 6 family members, she had learned early that dignity wasn't something others could grant or take away. It was something you carried within yourself, like a flame that no wind could extinguish. Each morning began the same way. Maria would wake at 4:30 in her small apartment on the south side, the radiator clanging its metallic symphony while she prepared coffee in the same chipped mug she had used for 15 years. The walk to the L station took her through neighborhoods where the American dream was still being fought for in corner bodegas and family restaurants where everyone knew everyone else's story. The contrast between her world and Samuel's struck her anew each day, as the train carried her from the warm chaos of community to the sterile perfection of isolation. The penthouse kitchen, with its marble countertops imported from Italy and appliances that cost more than most people's cars, had become Maria's domain. Here, surrounded by gadgets she learned to operate through trial and necessity, she created order from the chaos of a family that had forgotten how to be a family. She prepared meals that went largely uneaten, arranged fresh flowers that went unnoticed, and left small touches of warmth that disappeared into the emotional vacuum of the Hawthorne home. Samuel's routine was as rigid as his emotional walls. He woke at precisely 5:30, spent 45 minutes in his private gym, showered in a bathroom that resembled a spa more than a functional space, and consumed his breakfast while reviewing financial reports on his tablet. His eyes never lifted to acknowledge Maria's presence as she refilled his coffee or cleared his dishes. To him, she was simply another automated system in his perfectly calibrated life, no more worthy of attention than the climate control system that maintained the apartment's constant 72 degrees. The children were casualties of their father's emotional bankruptcy. Lily, once a bright-eyed girl who had loved to help her mother in the kitchen, now moved through the apartment like a sleepwalker. Her school grades, once exemplary, had begun their steady decline as she struggled to process a grief too adult for her young heart. Marcus, dealing with his own adolescent anger, had learned to communicate only in grunts and slammed doors, his rage at the world's unfairness finding its safest target in his own family. Maria watched it all with the quiet observation skills that came from a lifetime of being overlooked. She saw how Samuel's jaw tightened when anyone mentioned Catherine's name, how his hand unconsciously moved to touch his wedding ring when he thought no one was looking, how he stood a moment too long at the window each evening, staring out at a city that sparkled with life he no longer felt capable of joining. The first test came on a Tuesday morning in December. Maria had been working for the family for 3 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythms of their dysfunction, but not long enough to understand the landmines buried in seemingly innocent actions. She had found a photograph while dusting Samuel's study, Catherine laughing at some long-forgotten joke, her arm wrapped around a younger, happier version of the man who now treated emotion like a contagious disease. Without thinking, Maria had simply moved the photograph to a more prominent position on the bookshelf, a small gesture meant to honor the memory of the woman who had once filled these rooms with life. She had no way of knowing that Samuel had deliberately buried that particular picture behind heavy volumes of financial journals, unable to face the daily reminder of what he had lost. When Samuel discovered the change, his fury erupted like a long-dormant volcano finding voice. His voice, when he called for Maria, carried a coldness that could have frozen the Chicago River. She found him standing beside his desk, the photograph clutched in his white-knuckled grip, his face a mask of barely controlled rage that spoke to depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. "Did you move this?" His question came out like an accusation, each word razor-sharp with implications she couldn't begin to decode. Maria nodded quietly, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for the storm to break. She had worked for angry employers before, had weathered accusations and tantrums from people who used their wealth like weapons against those they perceived as powerless. But something in Samuel's eyes, a raw agony that made her chest tighten with unwanted sympathy, told her this was different. "I'll pay you what your silence is worth," he said, his voice dripping with the disdain of a man who believed everything and everyone had a price. "But understand this: you clean, you cook, you maintain. You do not think, you do not feel, and you certainly do not presume to know what belongs where in my home." His words hung in the air like poison, each syllable designed to reduce her to nothing more than a function, a tool to be used and discarded when no longer useful. Maria felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the same sensation she had experienced countless times when employers had reminded her of her place in their hierarchy. But beneath the hurt, something else stirred, a recognition of the wounded animal behavior of a man lashing out at the world because he couldn't lash out at death itself. She said nothing, simply nodded and returned the photograph to its hiding place behind the financial reports. But as she resumed her dusting, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become her signature, she found herself studying Samuel with new eyes. This wasn't cruelty born of superiority, but cruelty born of survival. A man building walls so high and thick that nothing could get in to hurt him again, even if it meant nothing could get out either. The insult burned, but Maria had survived worse fires. Growing up with a father who drank away his paychecks and a mother who cleaned other people's houses to keep food on their table had taught her that words were just air, and air couldn't break bones or empty stomachs. What mattered was the work, the steady rhythm of service that had become as natural as breathing. But that night, as she rode the L train home through the neon-lit darkness of the city, Maria found herself wondering about the man behind the cruel words. What kind of pain did someone have to carry to make kindness feel like a threat? What kind of loss could transform a father into ice, a home into a museum, a heart into something that struck out at the very gentleness it secretly craved? Winter settled over Chicago like a heavy blanket, and with it came the true tests of Maria's resolve. The Hawthorne penthouse became a proving ground where every gesture was scrutinized, every kindness questioned, and every moment of genuine human connection treated as suspicious behavior from someone who should know better than to care. Samuel's attacks on her dignity came in waves, each one carefully calculated to remind her of her place in his world's rigid hierarchy. When she prepared his coffee a degree too warm, his criticism came wrapped in observations about the inferior education that obviously prevented her from following simple instructions. When she arranged flowers in a way that brought color to a lifeless room, he demanded she replace them with arrangements that matched his mother's old photographs, sterile, formal bouquets that looked like funeral decorations. The other staff members, emboldened by Samuel's example, began their own campaign of subtle cruelty. The building's concierge would delay giving her messages, forcing her to wait in the lobby like an unwelcome supplicant seeking an audience. The elevator operator, a thin man whose own powerlessness manifested in petty authority over others, would make her wait for the service elevator even when the main one stood empty, reinforcing the building's unspoken apartheid between those who mattered and those who served. But the cruelest cuts came from the children, whose own pain had been twisted into weapons they wielded against the one person brave enough to keep trying to reach them. Lily, barely 13 years old, had learned to use her mother's memory like a sword against any woman who dared show her kindness. When Maria brought her soup during a particularly bad cold, Lily's response was a poison arrow aimed directly at the heart. "My mother made soup better than this," she said, her young voice carrying an adult's capacity for calculated cruelty. She didn't need to buy it from a can like poor people do. Marcus, older and therefore more sophisticated in his arsenal of emotional warfare, preferred the subtle knife twist to his sister's blunt attacks. He would leave his rooms in deliberate chaos, not from typical teenage carelessness, but as a test to see how far he could push the woman who cleaned up after him. When Maria would inevitably restore order from his created mess, he would complain to his father that she had moved his things, violated his privacy, overstepped the boundaries that separated servant from family. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, but Maria absorbed them with the quiet strength of someone who had learned to bend without breaking. She understood, in ways that Samuel couldn't, that their cruelty came from a place of devastating loss. These children were drowning in grief they didn't know how to process, and she had become a convenient target for all the anger they couldn't safely direct at their father or their dead mother. The staff kitchen became Maria's refuge during these dark months, a small space tucked away from the main apartment where she could sit with her simple lunch and pretend for 20 minutes that she was invisible by choice rather than circumstance. Here, surrounded by cleaning supplies and spare linens, she would sometimes allow herself to remember her own children, grown now and living their own lives, but once small and dependent on her strength the way these broken children needed strength they were too proud to accept. It was in this kitchen, during a particularly brutal January snowstorm that had trapped them all inside the glass tower, that Maria first began to understand the true scope of the Hawthorne family's tragedy. She had been organizing supplies when she overheard Samuel on a phone call in his study, his voice carrying through the apartment's pristine acoustics with crystalline clarity. "The insurance investigation is still ongoing," he was saying, his tone flat with exhaustion that went bone deep. "They keep asking about the circumstances, about why she was driving that night, about the argument we had before she left. As if grief isn't complicated enough without having to prove your innocence to claim what's rightfully yours." The words painted a picture that made Maria's heart ache with recognition. Catherine hadn't just died. She had died in the middle of a fight, leaving Samuel to carry not just the weight of loss, but the crushing burden of unresolved conflict. Every day since had been a reminder not just of what he had lost, but of words that could never be taken back, apologies that could never be spoken, love that had been interrupted mid-sentence by death's cruel punctuation. Understanding didn't excuse his cruelty, but it explained it. Samuel wasn't just mourning a wife. He was drowning in guilt, suffocating under the weight of what-ifs and if-onlys that multiplied in the dark hours when sleep refused to come. His wealth, built through careful investments in emerging technologies and cryptocurrency markets that had made him richer than his grandfather's generation could have imagined, meant nothing against the poverty of a heart that punished itself by pushing away anyone who might offer comfort. The revelation came with its own challenge. How do you show compassion to someone who interprets kindness as weakness, who sees gentleness as naivety, who has convinced himself that pushing people away is protection rather than self-destruction? Maria had no training in psychology, no degrees in counseling or therapy. All she had was the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had survived her own share of loss and emerged with her capacity for love intact. She began with the smallest possible gestures, acts of kindness so subtle they could be dismissed as coincidence. A cup of coffee prepared exactly the way Samuel liked it, appearing on his desk when he was too absorbed in work to remember he needed caffeine. Fresh flowers arranged in Catherine's favorite colors, placed in corners of the apartment where they would be noticed without seeming intentional. Classical music, the same pieces Catherine had loved to play on the silent piano, filling the spaces between conversations with melodies that reminded him of better times. Each gesture was a small rebellion against the emotional winter that had settled over the Hawthorne home. Maria knew she was taking risks. Samuel had made it clear that initiative was not welcome, that her job was to maintain, not to heal. But she also knew, with the certainty that comes from having raised children through their own dark seasons, that sometimes healing required stubbornness in the face of resistance. The children were harder to reach, their grief complicated by the particular cruelty of loss during adolescence, when the world already feels unstable and unfair. Lily had developed a habit of skipping meals, her young body rejecting nourishment as if eating were a betrayal of her sorrow. Maria began leaving small snacks in places where the girl would find them, not offerings that could be rejected, but discoveries that might bypass the wall of conscious resistance. Marcus, old enough to understand that his anger was hurting people but too young to know how to stop, had begun staying out later, and later, coming home with the telltale signs of experimentation with substances that promised temporary escape from pain that felt permanent. Maria knew better than to lecture or report. Instead, she began leaving lights on for his return, small signals that someone cared whether he made it home safely. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived disguised as disaster. It was a February morning when the city woke to a blizzard that shut down the L trains and left Maria stranded on the south side with no way to get to work. She had called the apartment's main number, prepared to apologize for the absence and accept whatever financial penalty Samuel might impose, but had been surprised when Lily answered the phone instead of her father. The conversation had started with Maria's explanation about the trains, but something in the girl's voice, a thin thread of panic barely held in check, had made her probe deeper. Samuel was in New York for business meetings. Marcus was at school, and Lily was alone in the apartment, experiencing what sounded like the beginning of a severe asthma attack brought on by stress and the apartment's dry winter air. Without hesitation, Maria had called a car service, using money from her grocery budget to make the expensive trip through storm-closed streets. She had arrived to find Lily huddled on her bedroom floor, wheezing and terrified, clutching an inhaler that had long since been emptied. The nearest pharmacy was 12 blocks away through snow that had turned Chicago's streets into an Arctic wasteland. But Maria had made the journey without question, returning with medication and the kind of calm presence that can only come from someone who has weathered storms of every variety. She had stayed with Lily through the worst of the attack, holding the girl's hand while the medication took effect, singing lullabies in Spanish that she had learned from her own grandmother decades earlier. For the first time since Catherine's death, Lily had allowed herself to be cared for without resistance, her exhausted body finally accepting the comfort it desperately needed. When Samuel returned from New York that evening, he had found them asleep on Lily's bed, his daughter breathing easily for the first time in weeks, and Maria curled in the chair beside her like a guardian angel who had forgotten to return to heaven. The sight had stopped him cold in the doorway, forcing him to confront the reality he had been running from. His children needed more than financial security and domestic maintenance. They needed love, and he had forgotten how to provide it. The conversation that followed was the first real communication Samuel and Maria had shared since her employment began. Speaking quietly in the hallway outside Lily's room, Maria had explained the day's events with simple directness, never asking for praise or recognition, simply reporting facts like a nurse updating a doctor on a patient's condition. But Samuel, perhaps worn down by travel and worry, had found himself asking questions that went beyond the professional. "How did you know what to do?" he had asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his usual veneer of cold command. Maria's answer was equally direct, equally free of performance or pretension. "I raised 3 children of my own, Mr. Hawthorne. Asthma doesn't care if you're rich or poor. Fear is the same in every language." It was the first time she had mentioned her own family, the first crack in the professional wall she maintained as carefully as he maintained his emotional distance. For just a moment, in the dim hallway light, they were simply 2 adults who had both learned hard lessons about love and loss, worry and responsibility. Samuel paid for the car service without being asked, but more importantly, he said something he hadn't said to anyone in over a year. "Thank you." The words came out rusty from disuse, but they carried weight that surprised them both. Gratitude, Maria realized, was perhaps the first step back toward humanity for a man who had convinced himself that needing nothing from others was the same thing as strength. Spring arrived in Chicago with its usual gradual insistence, snow giving way to slush, slush giving way to the first tentative green shoots that proved winter's grip was never truly permanent. The Hawthorne apartment began to change as well, subtle shifts that reflected the slow thaw happening in its inhabitants' hearts. Samuel still maintained his rigid routines and cold professionalism, but the cruel edge had softened slightly, replaced by something that might eventually become mere indifference rather than active hostility. Maria had been working for the family for 6 months when she made the discovery that would change everything. She was cleaning Samuel's study, moving with the careful precision that had become second nature, when she noticed that one of the heavy financial journals had been pulled slightly forward on its shelf. Behind it, barely visible, was the corner of what looked like a piece of paper. Curiosity overrode caution as Maria gently moved the book aside to reveal a letter, written in Catherine's flowing handwriting on personal stationery that still carried her faint perfume. The letter was addressed to Samuel, dated just 2 days before her death, and its contents revealed the truth that had been destroying him from within. "My dearest Sam," it began, "I know I've been distant lately. Know that my moods have been impossible for you to understand. The tests came back today, and I need to find the words to tell you something that's going to change our world. By the time you read this, I'll have found the courage to say out loud what I couldn't say face to face. I'm pregnant, and I'm terrified." The letter went on to explain Catherine's fears about having another child at 42, her worry about the risks to her health, and her concern about how the news would affect their teenager children who were already struggling with their own challenges. But more than anything, it revealed the depth of her love for Samuel and her regret about the fight they'd had the night before she died. A fight about money and priorities and time, the kind of argument that married couples have and expect to resolve over breakfast with apologies and understanding. Instead, she had died, carrying their unborn child and the weight of unspoken words, leaving Samuel to discover months later through this hidden letter that their last fight had been about bringing new life into the world, not ending their life together. The insurance investigation that had consumed him with guilt and rage suddenly took on new significance. Catherine hadn't been running away from their marriage, but running toward courage to share news she thought might bring them closer together. Maria carefully replaced the letter exactly where she had found it, but the knowledge it contained burned in her chest like a physical weight. She understood now why Samuel's grief had twisted into bitterness, why he pushed away anyone who tried to care, why he treated love like a luxury he could no longer afford. He wasn't just mourning what he had lost. He was being destroyed by what he had never known he had. The revelation changed how she saw everything about the family's dynamics. Samuel's guilt wasn't just about harsh words spoken in anger, but about missed opportunities for joy. The children weren't just grieving their mother, they were dealing with the unconscious knowledge that their father was carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone, and their own grief had become tangled up with his unexpressed pain. Understanding brought both clarity and responsibility. Maria knew information that could potentially free Samuel from the prison of his own self-recrimination, but she also knew that sharing it would mean betraying the privacy he guarded so fiercely. The ethical weight of the knowledge settled on her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't asked to wear but couldn't set down. Instead of confronting him directly, she began weaving small changes into the fabric of their daily routines, gestures designed to create space for healing without forcing recognition. She began preparing meals with ingredients from Catherine's old recipe cards, dishes that might trigger memories of happiness rather than loss. She arranged flowers in patterns that echoed photography she had seen of Catherine's own garden, creating visual echoes that might awaken dormant joy. Most importantly, she began showing the children the kind of patient, unconditional care that their mother would have provided, demonstrating through actions rather than words that love didn't die with the person who had embodied it most perfectly. She helped Lily with homework in the gentle way she imagined Catherine would have done, and she waited up for Marcus on nights when his grief drove him to seek solace in places that worried his family. The children began to respond to her consistency, drawn to the reliability of someone who showed up every day without conditions or demands. Lily started eating regularly again, her young body accepting nourishment from hands that offered it without judgment or expectation. Marcus began coming home earlier, perhaps recognizing that someone would notice and care whether he was safe. Samuel watched these changes with the suspicious eyes of someone who had learned to distrust anything that looked like good news. But gradually, reluctantly, He began to acknowledge that his household was functioning with a warmth and efficiency it hadn't known since Catherine's death. The apartment no longer felt like a mausoleum where grief echoed endlessly. It felt like a home where healing was possible, even if slowly and quietly. The transformation was fragile and incomplete, built on foundations that could be shaken by any reminder of loss or any resurgence of the guilt that had driven Samuel to build walls around his heart. But for a few months, the Hawthorne family began to remember what it felt like to live together rather than simply existing in proximity. And Maria began to believe that her quiet service might be making a difference that went beyond clean floors and prepared meals. That fragile peace was shattered on a rainy Thursday evening in September, when jealousy and suspicion combined with opportunity to create the perfect storm that would test everything Maria had worked to build. The attack came from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Chen, the building's head of housekeeping, who had watched Maria's growing importance in the Hawthorne household with resentment that had been festering for months. Mrs. Chen had worked in the building for 15 years, maintaining her position through a combination of efficiency and strategic invisibility that had served her well in a world where domestic workers were expected to blend into the background. Maria's approach, marked by initiative and genuine care, represented a threat to the established order that kept people like Mrs. Chen safely employed but never valued. The accusation when it came was devastating in its simplicity and impossible to disprove. Mrs. Chen reported to Samuel that she had seen Maria pocketing small items from the apartment. Nothing major, just trinkets and small valuables that a grieving widower might not immediately miss. The theft, she suggested, had probably been going on for months, hidden under the guise of exceptional service and false concern for the family's welfare. Samuel's reaction was swift and brutal, his year of suppressed rage finding a target that felt safe to destroy. He confronted Maria in the kitchen where she was preparing dinner, his voice carrying the full weight of betrayal and disappointment that had been building since Catherine's death. The accusations poured out like poison from an infected wound. Not just about theft, but about manipulation, about taking advantage of a family in crisis, about using their vulnerability to worm her way into their lives with false compassion. "I trusted you with my children," he said, his voice shaking with fury that was really fear. "I let you into my home, into my family's most private moments. And this is how you repay that trust? By stealing from us? By pretending to care while you rob us blind?" Maria stood perfectly still while the storm of accusation raged around her, her hands folded in front of her apron, her eyes steady and calm despite the devastation she felt building in her chest. She didn't defend herself, didn't protest her innocence, didn't point out the absence of evidence or the questionable motives of her accusers. Instead, she simply listened until Samuel's rage exhausted itself, then nodded quietly and asked for time to pack her belongings. The request infuriated Samuel even more than denial would have, because it suggested acceptance of guilt while maintaining dignity that made him feel small and cruel. He wanted her to fight back, to give him reason to feel justified in his attack, to prove that his suspicions were warranted by demonstrating the kind of character flaws that would make cruelty seem reasonable. Instead, Maria moved through the apartment, gathering her few personal items with the quiet grace of someone who had always known this day might come. She packed her extra uniforms, her small radio, the photograph of her own children that she kept on the shelf in the staff kitchen. Each movement was deliberate and calm, as if she were simply ending a shift rather than leaving behind months of patient work to heal a broken family. The children witnessed her departure with confusion and distress that their father was too blinded by his own pain to recognize. Lily cried openly, understanding instinctively that something important was being taken from her without explanation or justification. Marcus, older and more aware of adult complexities, watched with the kind of bitter recognition that comes from having learned too young that good things end without reason or fairness. As Maria reached the apartment door, carrying her single suitcase and wearing the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout her employment, Samuel made one final attempt to justify his actions to himself and his family. "I'll pay you what your silence is worth," he said, the words echoing his first cruel greeting, but carrying now the weight of everything that had happened between them. But Maria turned back to look at him, her dark eyes holding depths of sadness and wisdom that made his accusation seem small and petty. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said quietly, "some things can't be bought or sold. Some things just are." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of the cleaning products she had used and the much fainter scent of hope that had been growing in his home until he had strangled it with his own hands. The silence that settled over the apartment after Maria's departure was different from the silence that had reigned before her arrival. This was not the absence of sound, but the presence of loss, the hollow echo of something valuable that had been discarded without thought for its worth. Samuel told himself he felt relief, that he had successfully identified and eliminated a threat to his family's security. But the relief felt suspiciously like regret, and the security felt remarkably like isolation. Days passed into weeks, and the apartment began to revert to its previous state of sterile perfection. The new housekeeper, recommended by Mrs. Chen, was competent and invisible, exactly what Samuel thought he wanted. She cleaned efficiently, cooked adequately, and never showed the slightest interest in the emotional temperature of the household. She was, in other words, everything Maria had not been, but the children's behavior told a different story. Lily's asthma returned with a vengeance, triggered not by weather or dust, but by the stress of losing the one adult who had shown her unconditional care since her mother's death. Marcus began staying out later again, his brief period of coming home to someone who waited with concern reverting to the pattern of returning to empty rooms and indifferent supervision. Samuel himself found his sleep more troubled than it had been in months, his dreams filled with images of Maria's calm face as he had accused her of betrayal. The apartment ran smoothly, but something essential was missing. The sense that someone cared about the people who lived there, rather than just maintaining the space they occupied. It was while reviewing household expenses, looking for evidence of Maria's supposed theft, that Samuel made the discovery that would change everything. Tucked into her cleaning cart, forgotten in the chaos of her sudden departure, was a manila envelope containing documents that told a story completely opposite to the one he had convinced himself was true. The first document was a deed transfer for a small property in Pilsen, Maria's old neighborhood. But this wasn't evidence of stolen wealth being converted to real estate. It was proof of sacrifice on a scale that made Samuel's accusations seem monstrous in their injustice. The property was a rundown community center that Maria had been purchasing slowly, month by month, using money saved from her salary and small loans secured against her own modest possessions. The second document was even more humbling. A detailed plan for converting the community center into a safe space for neighborhood children, complete with after-school programs, emergency food services, and support for families struggling with addiction and poverty. Maria's vision, laid out in her careful handwriting, described a place where kids like she had once been could find stability and hope when their own homes couldn't provide either. The third document was a financial statement that revealed the true scope of Maria's generosity. She had been living on less than half her salary, sending money to her own adult children who were struggling with college debt and young families, while saving every possible penny to fund her community project. The theft Mrs. Chen had reported was actually evidence of someone so determined to give back to her community that she had been buying day-old bread and generic groceries to maximize the money available for her larger purpose. But it was the fourth document that brought Samuel to his knees in his study, surrounded by financial journals and investment reports that suddenly seemed meaningless in comparison. It was a letter of recommendation that Maria had been writing for Mrs. Chen, recommending her for a supervisory position at a different building, despite the petty cruelties and professional jealousy she had endured. "Mrs. Chen is a dedicated worker who takes pride in maintaining high standards," Maria had written. "Any employer would be fortunate to have someone so committed to excellence. I believe she has management potential that has not been fully recognized in her current position." The generosity of spirit revealed in those words, recommending someone who had orchestrated her downfall, finding genuine qualifications to praise in someone who had repaid kindness with betrayal, forced Samuel to confront the magnitude of his own blindness. He had accused a woman who was literally saving money to help children of stealing from children. He had destroyed someone whose response to workplace persecution was to write letters of recommendation for her persecutors. The realization hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over in his leather chair as the full weight of his injustice settled in his chest. He had become the kind of man who destroyed goodness because it made his own failures feel unbearable. He had taken someone's sacrificial service and repaid it with cruelty because acknowledging her character would have forced him to acknowledge his own lack of it. For the first time since Catherine's death, Samuel cried, not the bitter tears of self-pity he had shed in private, but tears of genuine remorse for harm he had caused to someone who deserved better. The document spread across his desk told the story of a woman who had spent her life serving others while building something beautiful for her community, and he had nearly destroyed both her reputation and her dreams, because facing his own guilt was easier than facing his own need for the kind of love she had offered freely. The search for Maria began immediately, but finding someone who had spent her life being invisible proved more challenging than Samuel's wealth and connections had led him to expect. Maria Santos was not listed in any of the professional networks or social media platforms that made tracking people routine for those with resources. She existed in the informal economy of people who clean houses and care for children and maintain the invisible infrastructure that keeps society functioning. It was Lily who provided the breakthrough, remembering that Maria had once mentioned taking the Red Line to work from a stop near a church called Santa Ana. Armed with this single clue, Samuel began what felt like a pilgrimage through neighborhoods he had never thought to visit despite living in Chicago for over a decade. Pilsen revealed itself as a world within a world, vibrant, community-oriented, filled with the kind of authentic human connection that his penthouse apartment had always lacked. He found her at the community center she was trying to save, painting walls in a building that looked barely habitable but somehow radiated hope. She was wearing old clothes splattered with primer, her hair covered with a bandana, working alongside a group of teenagers who clearly adored her. The scene was so far removed from the sterile perfection of his world that for a moment he wondered if he had confused her with someone else. But when Maria looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her face showed no surprise, as if she had been expecting this moment to arrive eventually. She set down her paintbrush, said something quiet to the teenagers that sent them outside, and then stood waiting for Samuel to find whatever words he had come to say. The apology, when it finally came, was halting and inadequate, every word revealing how little practice Samuel had with admitting fault or asking forgiveness. He tried to explain about his grief, about his fear of losing anyone else, about the way his guilt over Catherine had made him suspicious of anyone who tried to care, but even as he spoke he could hear how self-serving his explanation sounded, how they asked for understanding, without offering adequate acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. Maria listened without interruption, her dark eyes holding the same calm patience she had shown during his accusation months earlier. When he finally ran out of words, she nodded slightly and said simply, "I understand, Mr. Hawthorne. Grief makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was acknowledgement of his pain, of his humanity, of the possibility that good people sometimes cause harm without meaning to. Coming from someone he had wronged so deeply, it felt like grace he had no right to receive. Samuel pulled out a checkbook, intending to make some kind of financial reparation, but Maria's gentle hand on his arm stopped the gesture before it could be completed. "I don't want your money," she said quietly, "but if you really want to help, this place could use a benefactor who understands what we're trying to do." Looking around the building with new eyes, Samuel began to see what Maria saw. Not a rundown space that needed massive investment, but a foundation upon which something meaningful could be built. The community center wasn't just about providing services. It was about creating the kind of connected, caring environment that his own children desperately needed and that his wealth had somehow made impossible to find. The partnership that emerged was unlike any business relationship Samuel had ever experienced. Instead of contracts and formal agreements, it was built on shared understanding of what mattered and mutual commitment to something larger than either of them could accomplish alone. Samuel's financial resources combined with Maria's community knowledge and genuine care created opportunities that neither could have imagined working separately. But more than the community center, more than the programs for at-risk youth or the family support services, what grew between them was something Samuel had thought was impossible for him: friendship based on respect rather than power, connection based on shared values rather than mutual advantage. Maria treated his wealth as a tool to be used wisely, rather than a measure of his worth as a person, and gradually he began to see himself through her eyes, not as a successful businessman who had failed as a human being, but as someone who had lost his way and could still find it again. The healing wasn't instant or complete. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly and requires constant tending. But over months of working together, sharing coffee in the community center's makeshift kitchen, planning programs that would give neighborhood kids alternatives to the streets, Samuel began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under years of protective cynicism. Maria introduced him to families who worked multiple jobs to provide for their children, elderly people who had been caring for grandchildren when their own children couldn't, teenagers who were trying to build future despite odds that would have discouraged people with far more advantages. Through her eyes, he began to see poverty not as a moral failing, but as a systemic challenge that required systemic solutions, and wealth not as a scorecard, but as a responsibility. The changes in Samuel didn't go unnoticed by his children. Lily began to see glimpses of the father she remembered from before her mother's death. Someone who was capable of thinking about people beyond himself, someone whose success came with conscience attached. Marcus, initially suspicious of any change in his father's behavior, gradually began to respect the man who was working to make his mother's neighborhood a better place for people she would have cared about. Family dinners began to include conversations about the community center's progress, about the families they were helping, about the programs that were making a difference in kids' lives. The apartment, while still luxurious, no longer felt like a fortress designed to keep the world out. Windows were open to let in city sounds, and the breakfast table became a place where plans were made for helping others rather than just accumulating wealth. Maria remained who she had always been: humble, hard-working, more interested in results than recognition. She never moved into Samuel's world, never became someone who sought to profit from their partnership beyond the satisfaction of seeing her community's children having opportunities she had never had. But her influence on the Hawthorne family was profound and lasting, the kind of change that happens when someone's example challenges everything you thought you knew about what mattered. 2 years after that terrible day when his accusations had driven Maria away, Samuel stood in the main room of the renovated community center, watching children work on homework at tables he had funded, eating snacks Maria had prepared, learning from teachers whose salaries he helped pay. The space hummed with the kind of productive activity that made Chicago's South Side feel like the heart of something important rather than the periphery of something central. Maria moved through the controlled chaos with the same quiet grace she had brought to his sterile apartment. But here, her gifts found their proper context. Children called her name with genuine affection. Teenagers sought her advice on problems both mundane and serious. Parents trusted her with their hopes and fears for their families' futures. This, Samuel realized, was what he had been witnessing in his home without understanding. Not housekeeping, but caretaking. Not service, but love, made visible through action. The community center had grown into something that served over 200 families, providing everything from after-school tutoring to job placement services to emergency food assistance. But more than the programs, it provided what Maria had always provided: a place where people were seen and valued for who they were, rather than what they owned, where dignity was inherent rather than earned, where community meant everyone looking out for everyone else. Samuel's own transformation was evident not just in his financial contribution, but in his presence. He knew families by name now, understood the difference between charity that created dependency and investment that created opportunity, had learned to listen more than he spoke, and to follow Maria's lead in situations where her wisdom exceeded his experience. His children had grown into the kind of young adults their mother would have been proud of. Lily was studying social work with plans to return to community service. Marcus had chosen a college program that combined business training with coursework in social justice. They had learned from Maria's example that their advantages came with responsibilities, that wealth meant nothing unless it was used to create opportunities for others. The evening was growing late, and families were beginning to gather their belongings and head home, when Samuel found Maria in the center's small office, reviewing next month's program schedule by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, her face showing the kind of contentment that comes from work that matches values, from days that make a difference in ways that can be measured in children's laughter and parents' relief. "Maria," Samuel said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the easy familiarity of someone who had earned the right to casual conversation. "I need to ask you something I should have asked a long time ago." She set down her pen and gave him her full attention, the same patient focus she had always offered whether the subject was household schedules or life-changing decisions. "That night, when I accused you of stealing," he continued, his voice still carrying shame despite the years that had passed, "you never defended yourself. You never told me about the community center, never explained what the money was really for. Why didn't you fight back?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer with the care she brought to all important conversations. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience earned through decades of navigating a world that often demanded silence from people like her. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said finally, "sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the truth speak for itself. I knew who I was and what I was doing even if you didn't. Fighting your accusations would have been about my pride, not about justice. And pride." She paused, gesturing toward the bustling room beyond her office. "Pride doesn't feed children or keep teenagers off the streets or help families stay together through hard times." Her answer revealed the depth of character that had made her service so transformative in the first place. She had absorbed his cruelty not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to prioritize something larger than her own vindication. She had trusted that truth would eventually surface, that her work would speak louder than his accusations, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. "Besides," Maria added with a slight smile that suggested there had never been any real doubt about the outcome, "I knew you were a good man under all that pain. Good men eventually find their way back to goodness, especially when they have children who need them to." Samuel felt tears he still wasn't comfortable with gathering in his eyes as the full circle of understanding completed itself. Maria had never simply been his housekeeper. She had been his inadvertent teacher, showing him through example what it looked like to serve others without losing yourself, to maintain dignity in the face of disrespect, to choose love over self-protection, even when love wasn't returned. The community center around them stood as testament to what was possible when someone's character remained intact despite circumstances that might have justified bitterness. Every child who found safety here, every family that found support, every teenager who discovered alternatives to violence, all of it grew from Maria's refusal to let cruelty make her cruel, to let injustice make her unjust, to let pain make her stop caring about other people's pain. As they locked up the center and walked together toward the L station, where Samuel would catch his train back to a penthouse that no longer felt like prison, Maria asked about his plans for the weekend. It was the kind of ordinary question friends ask each other, but it represented something extraordinary, a relationship built on mutual respect between two people whose lives had intersected in ways that changed them both. Samuel's answer included plans to take Lily to visit colleges that specialized in community organizing, and to attend one of Marcus's debates on income inequality, activities that would have been inconceivable during his previous life of isolation and accumulation. His children had become people he genuinely enjoyed spending time with, not because they reflected his success, but because they had developed character worth knowing. "And you?" he asked as they reached the platform where their paths would diverge. His toward Lincoln Park, hers toward the apartment she still maintained in the same neighborhood where she had always lived. Sunday dinner with my own children and grandchildren, Maria replied, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose family relationships had been nurtured across decades of consistent love. My youngest granddaughter is learning to cook, so we're going to make tamales together. She has more enthusiasm than skill, but that's how all cooking teachers start. The image of Maria passing on traditions to another generation, creating the kind of family bonds that no amount of wealth could purchase, reminded Samuel of what he had almost lost and what he had been privileged to help preserve. Her family had supported her community work not because they didn't need her, but because they had learned from her example that individual happiness was inseparable from collective well-being. Their trains arrived simultaneously, and as they prepared to head toward their respective homes, Maria touched Samuel's arm gently, the same gesture she had used to stop him from offering money that first day at the community center, but now carrying the warmth of genuine friendship. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "thank you for helping me save this place. But more than that, thank you for letting me help save your family. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the chance to serve something bigger than themselves." The words stayed with Samuel throughout the train ride home, echoing in the rhythm of wheels on tracks as the city lights blurred past his window. Maria had transformed his understanding of service itself, not as something the powerful did for the powerless out of obligation, but as something human beings did for each other out of recognition that everyone's well-being was connected, that strength was meant to be shared rather than hoarded, that true wealth was measured in relationships rather than assets. His penthouse, when he reached it, still bore traces of luxury that would have impressed business associates and social acquaintances, but it also bore traces of something more valuable: photos from community center events, artwork created by children in Maria's after-school programs, plants that had been gifts from families whose lives had been touched by their partnership. The space had been transformed from museum to home, from fortress to foundation for work that mattered. The following Monday morning, Samuel arrived at his office to find a reminder of how far he had traveled from the man who had dismissed Maria's worth with crude calculations about the price of silence. His assistant had scheduled a meeting with potential investors interested in funding community development projects, work that had grown directly from his partnership with Maria and his growing understanding that sustainable business success required sustainable communities. But before the businessmen in their expensive suits arrived to discuss profit margins and tax advantages, Samuel found himself thinking about a woman who measured success in children's laughter, who calculated worth in families kept together, who invested her life savings in dreams that had no guaranteed return, except the possibility of making tomorrow better than today for people who needed champions. The irony wasn't lost on him that Maria, who had been accused of stealing, had actually been the most generous person in his life, generous with her forgiveness, generous with her knowledge, generous with her time and energy and hope. She had given him back his children, given his family a sense of purpose, given his wealth meaning beyond accumulation. And you, listening to this story perhaps while folding laundry that someone will scatter again tomorrow, or cleaning kitchens that will be dirty again by evening, or caring for children who may never fully appreciate the love you pour into their lives, you understand something that took Samuel years to learn, that the most important work in the world often goes unnoticed, that dignity comes from within rather than from recognition, that service freely given changes both the giver and the receiver in ways that can't be measured in dollars or cryptocurrency or stock portfolios. Maria's story is your story, reflected in every woman who has ever been invisible until someone needed her, who has ever been undervalued by people who couldn't function without her, who has ever absorbed cruelty while continuing to offer kindness. You know the weight of being essential yet unacknowledged, the burden of holding families together while your own struggles go unseen. But you also know, perhaps better than those you serve, what real wealth looks like, not in the bank accounts or investment portfolios or inherited assets, but in the trust of children who run to you when they're hurt, in the quiet satisfaction of work done well without fanfare, in the knowledge that your hands have created order from chaos and comfort from nothing more, than presence and care. Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Someone who became a better person because of your example, who discovered their own capacity for kindness by witnessing yours. Tell me your story in the comments below, because stories like yours and Maria's remind us that real power often lies in the hands of those who seem powerless, that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or wealth, and that the work of healing the world happens most often in kitchens and laundromats and community centers, performed by people who know that love is a verb rather than a feeling. If this story touched something in your heart, leave a like and share it with another woman who needs to be reminded of her own strength today. Subscribe to our channel so these stories can reach more people who understand that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear uniforms, carry cleaning supplies, and change the world one act of service at a time. For more stories that honor the dignity of work and the power of quiet courage, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the human heart. We'll see you in our next story, where we'll continue celebrating the ordinary people who make extraordinary differences in ways the world too often fails to notice. Remember, your work matters, your service has value, and your story, like Maria's, has the power to transform not just the lives you touch directly, but all the lives that are touched by those you've helped to heal. In a world that measures worth in dollars and recognition, never forget that the most precious currency is the love you give freely, expecting nothing in return but the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've made someone's burden a little lighter, someone's day a little brighter, someone's future a little more hopeful.